as we're on a tight schedule. Yeah, so Angelique Laskewitz would actually open this this webinar, our director, and she would have loved to open it, but unfortunately her connection was not good enough as she's traveling abroad. But she wanted me to share this message with you. I've looked forward to this webinar as the executive director of VBDO, but also as the chair of ICN the Netherlands Supervisory Board, as plastic pollution takes a great toll on ecosystems and biodiversity. All actors are needed to take action in preventing plastic pollution. This involves going into dialogue with consumers, companies, investors, and governments to create awareness, viable solutions and strategies. Current progress is not delivered as of yet. Therefore, I'm happy that this report and this webinar contributes to that mission. Have a great session. All right, back to my own words. So this project has been formed out of our annual VBDO company engagement that we perform each year. We've been focusing on biodiversity for years now and zoomed in on the plastic issue 2 years ago. So several plastic related questions were filed at the AGMs of, for example, Unilever and Ahold Delhaize. And we observed that these companies were working on the issue, but mainly incrementally and still avoiding radical solutions, or the ones that need to drastically reduce plastic pollution. The ClientEarth, our member since 2 years, has been supportive in tackling plastic issues in our corporate engagement program. And in our current partnership, we aim to increase attention of investors to plastic issues in their portfolio and provide them with the tools they need to take action. And today's webinar and the report are the first fruit of this collaboration. Good to know is that we'll record this session for our communications purposes. Next slide, please. So this is our program of today. First, a word of welcome, where we're in now. And after that, Rosa Pritchard, plastics lawyer at ClientEarth, will provide an expert background on plastic risks and company expectations. After that, I will take a bit longer than 10 minutes to guide you through the results of our Plastic Perspectives report. Due to time constraints, it will not be possible to answer questions for the first part of the webinar, so for Rosa and my part. But for the second part, we'll have that time available. And these presentations in the second part include, for example, Kelly McBee, which is coordinator for a circular economy at As You Sow. And she's calling in from Sacramento, so good morning, Kelly. And she will speak about the upcoming shareholder proposals, previous achievements, and upcoming challenges for the Investor Alliance. After that, we have Arthur from Mansvelt, Senior Engagement Specialist at Achmea Investment Management, and he will inform us about what investors can expect from companies and how they can adequately put these expectations on the agenda of those companies. At the end, we'll form a panel with all speakers, and there we also include Talia from Planet Tracker, which is a think tank, and I will properly introduce her when we get there. The panel is led by VBDO and ClientEarth, so Rosa and I. Next slide, please. And Rosa, may I give you the floor?
Great, thank you, Mart. Super. So, hi everyone. As Mart said, my name's Rosa Pritchard. I'm a lawyer working on plastics at ClientEarth. For those of you that don't know, ClientEarth is an environmental law NGO, and we use the law to protect the earth and its inhabitants. So that includes advocating for laws to protect climate and nature, as well as promoting access to justice, and of course working to hold governments and companies to account, including through legal interventions. Mart, perhaps you could just jump ahead to the next slide. And the next one. Brilliant, thank you. I work from our London office, but we're also present in several offices across Europe, as well as in the US and in Asia as well. And as Mart said, I work on plastics, particularly on what we call demand side, so focusing on companies that use significant amounts of plastics. And my areas of expertise are really transparency and disclosure on plastic. I've written quite some analysis as well about material financial risks linked to plastics for companies, and it's been a pleasure to work with VBDO on this project. Next slide, please. Thank you. So today I am going to give you an introduction to the plastics problem, and hopefully give you some context that will help you understand better the results of the analysis that VBDO has carried out, and kind of to provide some useful context. I'm going to talk you through the role of consumer goods companies and grocery retailers. So that's the groups that we've looked at in VBDO's analysis. I'm also going to very briefly mention the kind of risks that companies and investors are exposed to linked to plastics. And then I'm going to conclude with some thoughts of where we are now in the plastics problem and what the path looks like ahead. Next slide, please. So the first thing to say is that plastics traditionally has been seen and described as a waste issue, and in particular, a waste pollution issue. We've all seen the very powerful imagery of plastic leaking into the environment, entangling and choking marine wildlife, waste accumulating on beaches and rivers, blocking water systems, leading to waterborne diseases, and of course disrupting communities that depend on income from the marine environment, including from tourism and from fisheries. And of course, these are really important manifestations of the plastics problem and very severe manifestations of the plastics problem. But by assuming that plastics are only a problem at the waste phase, and even more so when they're not disposed of correctly or managed in formal waste systems, it correctly hides the full cost of the plastics crisis, and it might lead us down wrong or insufficient paths when we seek to address it as well. So there is an image on that slide of the plastics life cycle. I'm going to go into a bit more detail on the next slide, please. Thank you. So plastics causes environmental, climate, health and human rights concerns from cradle to grave. I'm just going to talk you through some of these in relation to the different stages of the plastics value chain. So at the point of extraction, 98% of plastics are made from fossil fuels, so from byproducts of oil, natural gas and coal, and there's actually a very strong link, particularly between fracked gas and some types of plastics. And as other industries and parts of the economy are seeking to decarbonise, plastics is increasingly seen as a growth market for the fossil fuel industry, and is currently predicted to be the largest driver of demand for growth of fossil fuels moving forward under business as usual scenarios. When it comes to plastics production, well, it's one of the most greenhouse gas intensive industrial processes. And much of that is derived from the on-site combustion of fuel, so not necessarily aspects that can be addressed through electrification. Another huge problem at the plastic production stage is toxic air pollution affecting local communities, and also leakage of plastic pellets manufactured at the production stage into the environment. These tiny pellets, primary microplastics, systematically leak into the environment and are very, very challenging to clean up. In the US, a recent lawsuit led to a penalty of $50 million against a plastic producer for leaking pellets into the environment. At the use stage, a subject that we're talking about more and more and hearing about more and more, and which VBDO has sought to address in the report, is the topic of hazardous chemicals. Plastics, including plastic packaging that we use for food and drink packaging, they all contain many chemicals, and some of these chemicals are added intentionally to give plastic certain qualities, and others are present as a result of contamination, chemical reactions, industrial processes, exposure to the elements. And we're learning more and more about these chemicals and problems related to them, including links to health conditions. And for recycled plastics, this issue is particularly problematic. The full chemical composition of virgin plastic is in many cases unknown when it gets to the application stage. So as you can imagine, when you mix it all together for the purposes of recycling, toxicity becomes a real issue. And then we've got formal waste management and informal waste management. So the OECD found that in 2019, less than 9% of plastics were recycled, and the majority of the remainder was incinerated or put into landfill. From an emissions perspective, incineration is akin to the burning of fossil fuels. Also gives rise to toxic air pollution, soil pollution, etc. And the sheer quantity of plastic waste that we generate means that even countries with the most mature waste management infrastructure are unable to manage the amount of waste that we are producing, and this results in the waste trade. So shipments of waste to other countries, and in many cases countries that actually are not able to effectively manage their own domestically produced plastic waste. And where domestic waste management infrastructure is lacking, communities obviously have to respond to that issue and find their own ways to deal with growing amounts of plastic waste. And some of these include dumping in unsanitary landfills and open burning. Obviously, both of these have very severe environmental pollution and public health impacts. So without mentioning the marine ocean pollution issue, these are a substantial and non-exhaustive list of the impacts of plastics. The only way to address all of these impacts collectively is to look at the issue at the source. Next slide, please. So why are we looking at these sectors, the fast-moving consumer goods sector and the grocery retail sector? So plastic packaging is the largest single application of plastics. In the EU, plastic packaging accounts for about 40% of plastics demand. And plastic packaging makes up an even greater proportion of plastic waste, and that's because of its short lifespan. So we may be talking in some cases a mere sort of useful life of a couple of hours before plastic packaging ends up being thrown in the bin. And obviously the giants of the consumer goods world and the grocery retail world, including those that are mentioned in VBDO's report, are major users of plastic packaging. So, for example, we took one of the consumer goods companies listed in the report and we assessed its plastic packaging footprint, compared it to the global plastic production rate, not just the plastic packaging production rate, but plastic production overall, and found that alone that company could be responsible for 0.5% of global plastics demand, which is obviously quite a significant amount. And especially on the consumer goods side, we're often talking about very international players as well, players that are present and selling into markets all over the globe, including lower income countries with serious issues with waste management, and that really countries that are facing the cold face of the plastic pollution problem. So, for example, in the last 5 years, a citizen science project known as the Brand Audit has collected data on plastic litter all around the world. And some of the companies included in VBDO's report have been found to be the top plastic polluters in countries like Bangladesh, Maldives, and Indonesia. So Danone, for example, has been the top plastic polluter for the last 3 years in Indonesia. Next slide, please. So studies on the costs of plastic pollution to society show very alarming results. There are obviously lots of complexities in producing such a calculation, especially given the myriad impacts that plastics has on people and on the planet. But Carbon Tracker has assessed that for each ton of plastics produced, the externalities, so the costs borne by those other than the companies producing it, are around $1,000. And at the time of writing that report, that was about equal to the cost of plastic itself. Another assessment has put the externalities in terms of carbon emissions, ocean pollution, health costs, collection of waste costs at around $350 billion a year. So clearly this high dependency on single-use plastic exposes companies that are using it to risks, because as pressures build to move to internalize these costs to the actors that are using plastic, profiting from its use, this generates a significant financial risks. So if we look at the reputational angle, for example, since 2015, really, plastic pollution has been one of the environmental issues that ranks most highly in terms of consumer concerns for companies, and being linked to plastic pollution publicly has become a substantial reputational liability. So, for example, I'm sure you didn't miss the criticism of Coca-Cola's sponsorship of COP, for example. On the regulatory side, in Europe especially, we've seen significant strides in regulating the plastics problem in the last few years, and for the companies that are moving slowly, perhaps not predicting those regulatory changes, not adapting, there are going to be substantial risks in those developments. And then, of course, there's litigation. So we've been following this closely in ClientEarth, that there really has been an increase in momentum on plastic-related lawsuits against companies all around the globe, especially in the US and also in Europe. Next slide, please. So what have companies been doing? Is it enough? Are we on track to resolve this issue? So up until now, we have seen companies responding to substantial and growing pressure on plastics, but these approaches have not moved the dial in the way that it needs to move. So the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, which I'm sure many of you have heard of, it's a not-for-profit organisation that since 2018 has convened a global commitment in which companies signed up to common goals on plastics, and which entailed them collecting certain information on plastics as well, and published its annual progress report earlier this month. And it paints quite a disappointing picture. Collectively, the use of virgin plastics by these signatories has continued to grow, and most of the companies are not on track to meet the 2025 targets that they signed up to. In terms of the commitments that we've seen from FMCGs and from grocery retailers, many of the policies are still heavily focused and uniquely focused on recycling and not on reducing their dependence on plastics. Recycling is clearly going to be part of the way that we manage plastic into the future, but alone it is just not going to be enough. The US recently revised its recycling rate down to 5%. I mentioned earlier in the presentation a global recycling rate of about 9%. And the problems with recycling plastics are not easily surmountable. So of course, there's a number of types of plastics, and the fact that it cannot be recycled infinitely, unlike other materials. The quality of plastics degrades during the recycling process to the point that it can't be used anymore. It needs to be mixed with virgin plastics to retain performance. And of course, the toxicity point, which I mentioned earlier. A study conducted by the Pew Trust has demonstrated that even the most ambitious trajectory of improving recycling infrastructure and designing for recyclability would still entail an increase in plastics entering the ocean rather than a decrease, unless we couple it with a reduction in the amount of plastics that we produce. So it's time for a reset and to start thinking about how we can reduce our dependence on single-use plastic packaging. And I, for one, think that investors have a very powerful role to play in this transition. Thanks very much. I look forward to hearing the rest of the presentations.
Thank you, Rosa. All right, let's move on to the report and the results of the Plastic Perspectives research. Next slide, please. Perhaps it's good to first zoom in a bit on the methodology. So within our Plastic Perspectives research, we have evaluated transparency, ambitions, and efficacy of 18 companies, and we've selected 10 grocery retailers and 8 FMCGs, and they're all listed on stock exchanges across Europe and the UK. And we've based our selection of listed companies on several criteria, namely consumer focus, market share, their plastic footprint, and international spread. Well, it's good to know that our research does not provide a full sector overview, but instead we aim to provide investors with insights into how these companies are dealing with plastic packaging. We achieved a 44% response rate, with 7 out of 10 grocery retailers responding and 1 out of 8 FMCGs. So we found that especially grocery retailers want to engage with us and share their viewpoint, data, but also challenges. And more information about our methodology and the data inquiry that we sent to all the companies can be found in our report. Next slide, please. So how to read the report? Here's a short example of how we present our results. So we've summarized all results at the beginning of the report and dive deeper into each priority action in other sections of the reports. And there we also provide the data for each company in scope, which makes it easier to compare the companies in more detail. But for this presentation, I will keep it to the summaries. So first on plastic footprints. We find that current transparency about plastic usage is problematically low. Only half of the grocery retailers report on their own brand plastics usage. Additionally, only 2 of the 10 grocery retailers report on their branded plastic usage in tonnage. And with branded content, we mean, for example, Tesco selling Coca-Cola products. And this distinction is important as all plastics sold need to be considered. You can see it more as scope 1 and scope 3 plastic emissions. So the surveyed FMCGs are found to be generally more transparent on their plastic usage than grocery retailers. 6 of the 8 FMCGs provided data on their plastic footprint. It was disappointing to find companies still not reporting on their plastic footprint. Next slide, please. Yes. Let's have a look at the total plastic reduction targets. So we observed that half of the grocery retailers set absolute plastic and reduction targets, and 7 out of 8 FMCGs have set virgin plastic reduction targets. Virgin plastic reduction targets are not the same as total plastic reduction targets. They tackle different things, and we find it unfortunate that these reduction targets are, except for Unilever, solely virgin plastic reduction targets. As concluded by the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, reduction of virgin plastic usage is mostly driven by an increase in recycled content. Since recycling alone does not prevent severe global plastic pollution, reducing overall plastic usage is essential, and we find that FMCGs really need to start setting absolute plastic reduction targets. Next slide, please. As mentioned with the previous slide, a sole focus on recycling will not solve the issue. Companies need to start thinking and acting differently. And reusable packaging is preferable in that, and installing new business models should be a central element of a company's packaging strategy. However, only 3 of the 10 surveyed grocery retailers and half of the surveyed FMCGs do report on the percentage of primary plastic packaging that is reusable. Also, if we look at the total percentage of reusable plastic packaging used, this is still very low. It's between 0 and 5% that we found. Leading researchers conclude that companies should actually aim for a reusability rate of 80%, so we're not there yet. So to date, of the companies in this analysis, only Coca-Cola has set a plastic reuse ambition target for its entire group. Coca-Cola Europe Pacific Partners sets the bar at 25% reusable packaging by 2030. Well, I think that the results on reuse and the low ambition is quite concerning. Therefore, we've worked together with and included a 2-page on the report from reuse consultancy Unpackaged on how companies can improve their reuse strategy. And I invite you to read this. I think it's pretty workable and also interesting for investors. And I will mention it again, recycling strategies alone will fail to resolve the plastics crisis, so reduction and reuse must be prioritized. Nevertheless, recycling will continue to play a role. So let's zoom in on recyclability of packaging. We have found that half of the grocery retailers and 3/4 of the FMCGs report on the recyclability percentage of their own brand packaging. The percentage of own brand packaging recyclability range between 36% and 90%. This is quite a broad range. And also what we see is that the methodologies used by the companies makes comparing quite difficult. They're quite different. We've also assessed the extent to which companies are incorporating plastic recycled content in their plastic packaging. Currently, 6 of the 10 grocery retailers and 6 out of 8 of the FMCGs report on the average percentage of recycled content in their packaging. These percentages range between 5% and 27%. In the past, companies have set targets to include more recycled content in their products, and they also have been called out for failing to meet these targets. Next to that, there have been reports of companies failing to meet targets on recycled content due to the challenges in obtaining sufficient quantities of recycled content. Because when everybody wants to meet these targets, it's difficult to also get the product. Another issue with recycled content is the possibility of presence of substances posing health risks. And we've also looked at this and how companies communicate about this. Next slide, please. So as you might know, plastics are a mixture of chemicals, as Rosa also mentioned, and they contain substances that are added intentionally, but also unintentionally. Well, in either case, substances in packaging are known to migrate from packaging into food and drink, ending up in your body, but also the environment. So we've assessed if the companies in scope are transparent about phasing out these hazardous substances and substances with environmental and health concerns. and we do not observe a lot of transparency on this, which might pose a risk to these companies in the near future. However, in theory, companies might have privately phased out these substances and not reported on this. If this is the case, we would recommend companies to state this publicly to provide greater clarity on this important issue. So for this section, we have used information provided by InfluenceMap. You might know them. InfluenceMap is an independent think tank which analyzes climate lobbying and policies. And in 2022, they've made their first analysis on how companies and their industry associations are active on lobbying on plastic-related regulation instead of climate. For example, on key elements of the EU Eco-Design for Sustainable Products regulation, also called ESPR, which is the most progressive packaging policy as of yet. No evidence was found of grocery retailers taking a public position on the ESPR. However, a reason for the absence of a clear position could be that their European regulatory interests are represented by their industry associations, where we see quite a negative stance, because these industry associations are mainly aiming to weaken the ESPR and misalign it with an ambitious and sustainable plastic packaging strategy. In comparison, 3 out of 8 FMCGs have engaged directly on the ESPR, with L'Oréal, Unilever, and Nestlé showing support for some elements of the legislation. Compared to these companies, industry associations advocate mostly negatively and are more actively. This negative positioning of the industry association could outweigh the positive influence of direct company engagement on circular economy legislation. So what we find is that companies need to align their own ambitions with that of their industry associations. Although described in more detail in our report, I would like to go over to some key results. Well, I can say that the plastic strategy starts with a full plastic footprint, but still over a third of companies are not publishing any data on their plastic footprint. For all but one grocery retailer, the plastic footprint data is incomplete, so companies need to do better on this. But there are also other significant gaps in transparency. Data and definitions on multiple topics are missing, and it was surprising to see that companies are providing quite patchy data on their use of hazardous substances and problematic plastics, which may pose risk to consumer health and could disrupt recycling processes. So we see this as an emerging risk for the coming years. Well, again, I want to state again that recyclability does not equal recycling. What we see with the companies is that there's a large focus on increasing recycled content and reducing virgin plastics. Although these aspects have a function in ground total, this is not reducing the dependence on single-use plastics and won't solve the entire plastic crisis. As national recycling rates remain low, and the word recyclable does not mean it's likely to end up being recycled, we still need more focus on, for example, extended producer responsibility. Next to that, we do not observe a priority in plastic reduction. As companies base their plastic policies around recycling, they pay limited attention to the high priority strategies that are essential in the circular economy, such as the overall reduction and switching to reusables. Only 4 out of 18 companies in scope have a total plastic footprint reduction target. The others have no focus on decreasing their total plastic footprint. Another one is combined targets are the norm, but results are mainly focused around recycling. So almost all companies, 85%, have combined targets. This means that they say that 100% of plastic will be recyclable, compostable, or reusable. And this diffuses the main goal of reduction, because they should be disclosing separate targets and their progress on that. I would like to conclude with results from InfluenceMap. Companies need to be more supportive of progressive legislation related to plastics. Our analysis shows that direct and indirect lobbying efforts of industry associations are generally lobbying against circular economy legislations. For the recommendations of this report, I would like to invite you to read it. And also, our next speaker will shine a light on this. So if you have a specific question about the report, I also welcome you to send VBDO an email or give us a call. But for now, I'd like to give the floor to Kelly McBee, which makes significant efforts with As You Sow's Investor Alliance. Kelly, the floor is yours. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Mart, and thank you to VBDO for having me today. And I want to thank all of you for joining us to talk about these important findings in this new research. My name is Kelly McBee. I am a coordinator for a circular economy at As You Sow. As You Sow is a US-based nonprofit, or as we like to say, for benefit organization representing investors on key dialogues with corporations around environmental and social responsibility. My role at the organization is to specifically coordinate our discussions and research on the life cycle of products and packaging, specifically plastic packaging. Next slide, please. So As You Sow is celebrating our 30th anniversary of work on these issues. And we like to say, as corporations sow, so shall they reap. So these are a handful of the companies that we have been working with over the last few decades, not just on plastics and packaging, but on corporate sustainability generally. Next slide. In our engagement on this, the benefits that we work with companies to see through engaging with us are increased share value, extended employee retention. People want to work at a company that is responsible for its social and environmental performance, improved brand reputation, greater consumer loyalty, and the like, and also reduced risk on the legislative side and the regulation side. So if you're not familiar with that phrase, as you sow, so shall you reap, that is how we are named. Next slide, please. I like to put this slide in here to discuss very quickly just the breadth of issues that we discuss with corporations at As You Sow. As I mentioned, my focus is on plastics and packaging, but as an organization, we are also engaging companies on climate change, toxins in the food system, slavery in supply chain, diversity in corporate boards and in corporations, employee workforce, racial justice, and also egregious CEO pay, looking at that balance between what CEOs are paid and what their workers are paid, and whether or not CEOs are held accountable for meeting their goals on things such as a plastic reduction target. Next slide. So as an organization in the 2022 shareholder season, we engaged nearly 200 different US-based companies. About half of those engagements, these direct dialogues, resulted in the filing of a shareholder resolution where we asked the company to make a specific change. My favorite number on this slide is that 56 of those 99 resolutions were able to be withdrawn as we negotiated new actions by a company in exchange for us withdrawing that resolution. So in future slides, I'll talk about some of those engagements that we had on plastic and the success we saw there. My other favorite number on this slide is that $2.18 trillion in shareholder value. So these are the wealth representations of shareholders that supported these actions by companies to have greater environmental and social responsibility. Next slide, please. All right, so what did we do on plastics reduction at As You Sow in the last two shareholder seasons? So in 2021 and 2022, and you can click one more and we'll see another name pop up there. Thank you. We had two different focuses on our shareholder engagements, specifically engaging companies on reuse and on new plastic reduction goals. So Mart mentioned that Coca-Cola was the only company surveyed in the VBDO research that had a reuse goal. I'm proud to say that that was something that As You Sow worked with the company to set. They were the first consumer goods company to set such a big goal. And as Martin mentioned, by 2030, the company expects that 25% of its volume of product will be delivered in reusable and refillable packaging. This is a very impressive goal, also a very difficult goal to achieve. So we will continue to work with the company to make sure that they meet these aspirations. We also recently worked with Pepsi to set a similar goal to Coca-Cola. They have not yet announced it, but they have committed that they will be announcing a similar reuse goal to Coca-Cola's. PepsiCo recently acquired SodaStream, which, if you are familiar, is an at-home service to carbonate your own beverages and then add a liquid flavor. Now, we also worked with a number of companies, you'll see their names on the screen, to set new plastic reduction goals. So all of the companies you see here are companies that As You Sow filed a shareholder resolution with after determining that the company was susceptible to numerous risks by not having a focus on plastic reduction. So after dialogues with all of these companies, they have agreed independently to set new plastic reduction goals. Our next step at As You Sow is to continue to work with these companies to make sure that they achieve these goals and that they work together on introducing new reuse models collaboratively as a priority strategy for achieving these goals. And it's important that elimination of plastic and the expansion into reuse is the priority strategy for companies before a different strategy, like, say, use of recycled content, because where we see the most environmental and regulatory risks on plastics is in the use of plastic itself, whether or not it is recycled content. You see some benefit by increasing recycled content, but really these companies need to be reimagining the way that they deliver product to consumers and really breaking that take, make, waste supply chain model and making it more circular. Next slide, please. Fantastic. So I titled this slide Complementary Investor Research. So about this time last year, As You Sow released a scorecard where we surveyed 50 different companies in the US on their plastics footprint. We looked at very aligned set of metrics as the recent research we are here talking about today, but with a US focus. So in our research, we ranked these companies on 6 different pillars of packaging responsibility. Those pillars were plastics use reduction efforts, use of recycled content, the transparency of data at a corporation, their exposure to reuse and their commitment to investigate new reuse, their support for recycling of their packaging at its end of life, not just in theory, but in practice and at scale. And then lastly, their adoption of an extended producer responsibility model, where they are shifting their idea as a corporation of their responsibility from their packaging, not just to the point that it reaches the consumer, but at the end of life of their packaging. So we ranked these 50 companies on 44 different metrics within those pillars, and no company got an A in our research. And those were for reasons very similar to the new VBDO report. These companies have not yet adopted, most importantly, this circular economy mindset where they are responsible for the financial requirements of capturing their packaging at end of life, nor are they investing enough in reuse technologies, nor getting their packaging actually recycled in practice and at scale. Next slide, please. So again, incredibly complementary to the VBDO report. We found that these mostly US-based companies need to be eliminating plastic packaging, not just substituting it for a different material or recycled content. They need to be setting new and larger goals to expand reuse and refill. They need to financially invest in recycling infrastructure. I'm going to take a minute to talk about this point in particular, because in our research at As You Sow and in our engagements with companies, it's very common for companies to make a one-time contribution to, say, a nonprofit organization working to expand recycling infrastructure. In the US, the leading organization here is the Recycling Partnership, or TRP. TRP recently did research evaluating the cost to companies to actually make sure that their packaging gets recycled in practice and at scale. And that cost was $350 for every metric ton of packaging. So I know Rosa had some great statistics about what it would actually take for companies to make sure that their packaging gets recycled as well. This is just one other data piece. So our report ranks companies about whether or not they are contributing financially at that degree. And our 2023 shareholder engagements will partly focus on this idea of corporations taking responsibility for ensuring their packaging gets recycled. So just to close out, our last two findings in our research was to ensure recyclability in practice and at scale. Again, that's not just making it recyclable in theory, but actually taking some accountability to make sure it happens. And then supporting extended producer responsibility, or EPR. Next slide, please. Just to close out our research, if you want to find more, we have an online data visualization tool. I take a screenshot here of one metric on reusable packaging for Coca-Cola and these specific metrics that the company does or does not meet. And then you can, if you want to get playful, compare companies to one another. So this is a screenshot looking at Coca-Cola, Pepsi, and Keurig across these different metrics for comparability. Next slide, please. Now, that research that we did at As You Sow informs the actions of an alliance that As You Sow has the privilege of coordinating, called the Plastic Solutions Investor Alliance. Several of our PSIA members are here on the line today. I saw on the participant list, so thanks for joining us. But the PSIA is a place for global investors to coordinate with one another on actions that companies need to be taking in order to reduce risks in their portfolios. So we have 55 global investors at present. The PSIA grows every year. This was something that we started 4 years ago. And at present, we have nearly $3 trillion in collective assets under management. And as an alliance, we engage several companies on their plastic exposure. Our top 5 engagements to date and moving into 2023 are Nestle, Pepsi, Coca-Cola, Procter & Gamble, and Unilever. And the role that the PSIA fills is to create a united front for investors to engage companies. So we can engage Unilever from a variety of perspectives on the same issues. And we found these dialogues to be very productive. Next slide, please. So we ask all of our Plastic Solutions Investor Alliance members to add their name to our declaration for change. And the top 3 issues in that declaration are to get these companies to set new goals for reuse and refill, to ensure recyclability in practice and at scale, and to support extended producer responsibility. So that last bullet, most of our dialogues with these companies have been working to get these companies to publicly announce responsibility for packaging at its end of life, and then to work together. So Unilever, one of our key engagement companies, as noted in the VBDO report, is really leading the pack so far on EPR. Their CEO, Alan Jope, has come out numerous times and has a quote in their ESG report in big letters that says, "Our packaging waste is our financial responsibility." And then they are backing that statement up with contributions for recycling. We want to see more companies come out with announcements like that. Next slide, please. Just to highlight a couple of our most recent actions with the PSIA, we coordinated a large investor letter for support on the recent UN Global Plastics Treaty. And we've also coordinated 2 different letters to Marks & Spencer and Burberry, because these 2 companies have recently withdrawn their participation in the EMF Global Commitment, which Rosa mentioned in her presentation. These letters were to tell the companies that plastic should remain a key priority issue. And we have since been engaging these companies on how they continue to maintain those efforts. Next slide, please. That does it for my presentation. I would love to answer any questions that you all may have. Thanks again for having me.
Thanks, Kelly. Yeah, I have a question. So Coca-Cola pops up a couple of times in your presentation, in ours, also in Rosa's, for example, for the brand audit report, where it states that they're the biggest polluter in certain regions. But they also, in a lot of reports, also in ours, I think also in your plastic polluter scorecard, they pop up as the highest scoring company. So what's your view on this contradiction, and how do you work with this in your engagements?
Such a great question. Thank you, Mart. We as an organization really see this as a demonstration that even the companies doing quote unquote the most, and maybe on this issue, are doing nowhere near enough. That some action to date has been more performative than it has been effective. And so these companies, they may tout something like a new goal, but if that goal isn't effective in practice, or isn't actually achieved, or isn't scaled to the degree of the problem, then it won't be enough. And that's something that we're engaging companies on. Like to set, for instance, just a 15% plastic reduction goal is not enough. The Pew Charitable Trust, some of the leading research on plastics, has said that companies need to be setting plastic reduction goals at least a third of their current consumption. And we see no company with a goal of that size. So to briefly answer your question, companies are starting to take effort on this, but even the leaders are not doing enough.
Thanks. And I guess that's also projected in your scorecard, right? So the progress that they make each year.
Yeah, and maybe I can add one final point on Coca-Cola, because I find it interesting. We have produced our scorecard twice now. We have a 2020 edition, a 2021 edition, and we will be launching it again in 2023. And last year, Coca-Cola was the top scoring company. And I think why that was in particular was that the company is one of the only ones that has a producer responsibility or an EPR focused goal. Coke has a goal to capture one bottle or can for every one that they sell. And they are matching that with investments in infrastructure to make sure that that actually happens.
Right. That's great to hear. That's good progress. All right. I don't see a question in the chat, but perhaps Rosa, do you have a question?
Yeah, I'd love to just jump in. Kelly, obviously, As You Sow works across many, many different topics. And I wondered if you had any observations about the reactions to the shareholder proposals on plastics versus those on other topics. Have you noticed anything in particular from perhaps even on investor willingness to support them, or perhaps also reactions from the companies that's perhaps different from other topics?
That's a great question. We recently put out a report on the full diversity of those almost 200 shareholder engagements that we had, and we do compare investor reactions. So more details could be found there. But my off-the-cuff response is that investors have been increasingly focused on plastic resolutions. Our resolutions have received some of the highest votes consistently compared to other issue areas, which to us signifies that this is becoming just even greater on the radar for folks. I'll say, you mentioned pellets, Rosa, in your presentation. We had a proposal at DuPont just 1 year ago about their exposure to pellet pollution and pellet spills. That resolution received 82% of investor support and was the highest ever voted resolution on environmental issues at the time. I think that has since been superseded just this year, but definitely an indicator of the interest here.
Perfect. Thanks, Kelly. All right, I think we can move on to Arthur. But thank you for your presentation. We will see you in the panel as well. Thanks. Okay, Arthur, can I give you the floor?
Yeah, thanks, Mart. Thank you very much for this very interesting report that you published today. And also thanks to Rosa and Kelly for their inspiring presentations so far. My name is Arthur van Mansvelt. As you can read, I work for Achmea Investment Management. If we go to the next slide. Yeah, and even the next one, I think that's very briefly about Achmea Investment Management, our organization. We are the asset management part of Achmea, a Dutch insurance company. And we manage assets of Achmea, but also from a number of Dutch pension funds, some 200 billion euro assets under management altogether. And I'm part of the responsible investment team, where we do client advisory on responsible investment policy, implementation of these policies, and also active ownership, including investor engagement, in which I'm mostly involved. So what I'd like to talk to you about today is why we as investors care for plastics, then briefly on what investors can do, what we need to expect from companies, briefly a few other points that we consider that what we need for this plastics transition, and then some concrete next steps. So first, why we care as investors, and very thanks to Rosa, who already presented an in-depth picture of all the risks related to plastic use, and especially the plastic waste as a key driver of biodiversity loss, but also increasingly as a health issue, which is also for us as a health insurance company very important. And I think so far presentations look very much back to the problem that we have today from the use of plastics, but particularly if we look ahead, you see predictions of growth of plastics growing exponentially. So the problem of plastic waste will also grow much more in the business as usual scenarios. Hence the urgency for reduction of the plastics use. And if you go to the next slide, Mart, then you will see some figures from the Pew and Systemic reports on the growth expected of plastic waste, leakage into the oceans, and total plastic volume in the oceans, which will grow if we don't manage to break that trend. We can move to the next slide, Mart. This is a picture from a UNEP report that shows where exactly the most leakage of plastic into the oceans is, and that's also makes clear, and I think Rosa already referred to the brand reports, the brand audits, where it was assessed in which regions products of certain brands leak in the environment. And this picture also shows that even if we have quite advanced regulation in Europe curbing the problem, then that doesn't at all solve the problem worldwide. So we definitely need more global action of companies, more responsibility, but also more global improved regulation, I think. Then a bit of the positive news. This is what is possible in breaking the trends, the contribution of different solutions like reduce of use, reuse of plastic products, also looking for alternative design, and then the contributions of mechanical and further advanced recycling. So there, it is possible in the future to break the trend, but it needs much more accelerated efforts, as many of the reports on plastic these days show. And particularly, I think Mart also said that in this contribution, that we have to shift attention from recycling towards the more start-of pipe solutions of reduce and reuse, and especially also alternative product design. So in a nutshell, what we need is businesses in the plastic value chain should much more rapidly accelerate their efforts and investments in reduce, reuse, and recycle. I think that's also one of the conclusions of the Global Commitment report that also was mentioned in the previous presentations. It was interesting that also Kelly mentioned this goal of about 30% of reduction use. I think it's very much desired that we have a more Paris Agreement-like global agreement on the target of plastic reduction. That's much more widely shared, and that also we can jointly ask from businesses. But not in the last part, we need more effective regulation to boost the business case for sustainable solutions. Because one of the things that we found in engagement with especially packagers in the last few years was that they may have sustainable solutions, but they're still very much more expensive than the regular solutions, and therefore are unable to break through in at scale in markets. They are now used and applied by several leaders in industries, maybe in some niche markets, but really to break through at scale these solutions, there should be a much better financial basis for these circular solutions, and we need regulation, I think, to make that business case. Then, very important, of course, also what investors can do. As shareholders in many of these companies that were mentioned before and that are featuring in the reports, we can use our investor leverage, of course, to enter in dialogue with these companies, as many of us already do. And also Kelly had some excellent examples of how you can do that and how you can escalate these dialogues also in resolutions. So we can use our votes or take the initiative in filing resolutions. And also important, expanding our leverage by working together in all that work. And then zooming in a bit more in concrete expectations. Oh no, sorry. I think the next slide is first on what we have been doing. Yeah, thanks, Mart. Very briefly, the work that we have been doing over the last 2 years from Achmea Investment Management. We identified the risks of plastic pollution related to biodiversity and health. As I said before, we joined the PRI, Plastic Investor Working Group, and started this engagement on plastic packages that I already mentioned. And through that work, we also found out about businesses that were supporting the drafting of the UN treaty. And we thought it was a good idea also to show support from the investors community part. It was great to find out after some time that also, As You Sow, have been doing that, building a coalition in the US. So looking ahead to maybe merge that work together also in support of this new business call for the global treaty that's now developing to provide input for the concrete negotiations on this treaty. And we, over the last few months, we have been working to start a new engagement on plastic packages, actually also inspired by this report by VBDO. We aim to target a few of the companies mentioned in this report. So that's work in progress. And then looking to what investors should expect from companies. I think there's a lot already being said about that, and there's also a lot of suggestions in the report by VBDO and ClientEarth that's published today. But also, the reports of the global commitments, the progress reports, and planet tracker reports that were recently published, they all show the urgency of the problem. And I think particularly interesting is that VBDO mentions the insufficient focus on reducing plastic use. The lack of transparency, of course, that's important. And also the need for wider support by companies on future legislation and the contribution of influence map, I think, to the report is very interesting. Then we can go to the next slide, Mart, zooming into some further concrete expectations. I think indeed we need to expect a more firm commitment from companies, especially on the reduce and reuse side. More ambitious targets, as were already mentioned, but they should made concrete in in-action plans that companies immediately start working on. And then on the disclosure, I think it's interesting to see a lot of developments there. The EMF already in the global commitment had an interesting framework where you can see what companies already report, but also SASB indicators increasingly focus on the use of plastics and disclosure about metrics there. And of course, earlier this year, the CDP announced also indicators in their company questionnaires, a complete set of plastic indicators. So much more information will be available. And I think it's partly the role of investors to ask companies to use these frameworks to report on it and make sure that they disclose on this type of data. What that should include is, for example, the plastic footprint that was already mentioned, the targets, phase out of fossil-based plastics, and of course, annual progress on these targets. And there are, interesting enough, also quite some guidances already for investors available. Through our work with the investor working group on plastics with the PRI, we have contributed to a number of engagement guidelines per part of the plastics value chain that provides interesting guidance for investors that like to engage on plastics. I already mentioned the EMF Global Commitment reporting, the SASB standards, but also CDP that's being introduced. And now we have, of course, the latest, this excellent report by VBDO, also with further guidance for investors. So there's plenty of material available for us as investors to use in engagement with the plastic value chain. What we would further need is, I think I mentioned it already earlier, strong policy frameworks to create a business case, because I think also Kelly mentioned the need for companies to start contributing to financing waste collection and recycling schemes. But it's quite difficult to ask that from companies and also from investors if there's not a sound business case behind such investments. And if there is, then there's much more incentives for business and opportunities to finance. Part can be done, of course, through extended producer responsibility, which is, I think, always an important base. And then further regulation, like Europe is now introducing, can further enhance that business case. And then, of course, finally, a good and strong UN treaty on plastic solution to also provide a regulatory base in jurisdictions where there's not such ambitious plastic regulation available yet. So that brings me to the next steps. We as investors will continue investor engagement with companies in the plastic value chain. We continue and build on the support for this UN treaty. And we are very open to further collaborate or investor collaboration also in the plastic space. We are already working with, for example, the Finance for Biodiversity Pledge, possibly Nature Action 100 that's about to launch, will also partly focus on plastics as a driver of biodiversity loss. And then also PRI starts a new program on circular economy, which can open opportunities. So all in all, we are interested and open to cooperate in these engagements. And then, of course, I'm open to questions from the audience now or later with the panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Arthur, for your presentation and also providing the case for cooperating on engagement. I do have a question for you. So we've been in touch on this issue for a year now, I think, updating each other.
Yeah.
And you've been working on this topic for quite a while already. So I'm wondering, how has investor uptake on this topic been so far, and how did it develop in the past couple of years? And do you think it's enough, or what do you think should be a priority for investors?
I think if you look at the overall figures and the need to reduce and to bend this trend of growing plastics use, we only just begun. So there's increasing awareness. I think also with the new CBD goals that will be hopefully adopted at Global Biodiversity Summit in December. That might also give the plastics agenda further incentive. But no, I definitely think there's much more engagement required. Also, a thing that we discovered with the engagement with the plastic packagers, that although companies take the topic quite serious and they are normally working hard, the goals they have and the pace of transition is basically way too slow to curb this trend or this current business as usual expected growth of plastic use. So everybody should just step up, and we hope to play a role in there as investors.
Thank you. Okay, so there's another question from Hester Holtland. I'm curious to know if there are any initiatives to collectively engage governments on legislation on plastic reduction.
Well, I think one example is, of course, the cooperation on the Plastics Treaty. Nationally, I'm not quite sure to what extent. I know that Ellen MacArthur Foundation and others are working with national governments on local plastic pacts, which could be a topic of more local and national engagement with governments. I don't know exactly what the status of that is, but the support for and providing input for an ambitious UN treaty could still be expanded, and that's something that we are working on also with this business coalition.
Thank you. All right, then I don't see other questions in the main chat. If there are, please post them there. I see a question of Rosa. Rosa, do you want to take the mic?
Yeah, that was more of an addition actually, just to that last question, that the key piece of legislation in the EU that we'll be seeing on this in the next couple of months will be a proposal for a revised packaging and packaging waste directive, and we can expect that to incorporate these ideas on plastic reduction as well. But I did have a question for Arthur, which is, you know, obviously we're here kind of in the room, me from an NGO, from civil society, and you from the investor space, and I'm wondering what your reflections are on what kind of tools or resources from civil society can be helpful from people like me, people like us, in terms of engaging with companies. Like how can that that intersection happen? What kind of things can we provide you with?
Thank you, Rosa, for that question. I think one thing that's particularly useful is the reports like UN VBDO today published. I also refer to the work of Planet Tracker there as a very important organization to challenge brands to accelerate their progress, but also to build public awareness on the topic, because I think that's very important and also builds on the pressure towards companies if the calls come from different directions, both from NGOs, civil society, and from investors, and where possible also from at least part of the consumers. But then one important thing that we experienced also in our engagement was that companies that were moving fastest on their own initiative were doing so because they expected regulation at quite soon to happen. So especially in the European Union, for example, and in other jurisdictions where increased or enhanced regulation is less likely, the pace of development is much slower. So yeah, companies also seem to position themselves quite strategically and also adopt the pace of their transition to development of legislation, what they expect. So the more regulation is announced, the faster they tend to act as well.
Thanks. All right. I think it's a good time to move to the panel. let's go to the next slide. And the next one.
That was my thank you.
And thanks, Arthur, for your presentations and answering the questions. But now it's time for the panel. So next to Arthur from Achmea Investment Management and Kelly from As You Sow, I would like to welcome Talia Bukiliu. I hope I pronounced it correctly. But she's Senior Plastics Investment Analyst at Planet Tracker. Planet Tracker, already named in this presentation, is a UK-based non-profit think tank that aims to align the capital markets with the planetary boundaries. So welcome, Talia. And for this, yes, and for this panel, I would like to invite all participants of the session to post their questions for the panelists in the chat. And I hope that together we can make this interactive session. Rosa will join me as a moderator, and we'll make a selection of your questions. If it's too many, we aim to collect the unaddressed questions and provide an answer to it next week. So to kick off, perhaps it's interesting to hear from you all three. What are your reflections on our report's conclusions, or what stands out for you? What do you take home from this? I'm curious. So Kelly, could you start with a question?
Absolutely. I think based on As You Sow's research as well, this report really backs up the findings that these companies are not doing enough, and they need to take action on a variety of areas. Most importantly, the idea of overall plastic elimination and expansion into reuse and cooperation with one another to take responsibility and adopt producer responsibility mindsets. I would just really appreciate it. What has become more of like a global call to action now.
All right, thanks for sharing. Arthur, what are your reflections?
Yeah, Mart, I think I mentioned already some of my views on the report, and I can very much also adhere to what Kelly said on that. Unfortunately, the conclusion of lack of progress, but I think it's an urgent call for more focus on the topic. Mm-hmm. The need for more regulation in our view, and also exposing lobbying of firms against legislation, while they may have public statements on the importance of circular economy. So there, I think we very much welcome the work also of Influence Map. One other thing maybe to mention is that quite some companies in the plastic value chain like to make public statements or start initiatives that look very attractive and very committed. Like, for example, the Alliance on Plastic Waste, the Alliance to End Plastic Waste. But Planet Tracker wrote an interesting report on that. And you can sometimes question these initiatives compared to just publicly supporting a global UN treaty, for example, or connecting to wider government-supported initiatives that are already in place, or maybe just making sure that EPR systems are developed more rapidly, which are normally much more effective than some of these business initiatives.
Yeah, right. Thanks for that. And Talia, we have not heard from you before. What are your reflections on the report?
Yeah, first of all, thank you for having me, and thanks for the presentations. Everything was very interesting. Now about the report, I agree with everything that has been said, and Arthur mentioned that earlier. That report and similar reports are very valuable for all of us to understand better what is happening in the market and how we can move towards the pollution, towards the solution. To move to find the way to stop the plastic pollution. The key things that I have taken from the report, and I agree fully, is that transparency is the key, and we have to fight towards that. And another thing that I read, and I wasn't very happy about that, was that, if I'm not mistaken, sorry if I'm wrong, 4 or 5 out of the 18 companies, they are having targets towards plastic reduction, which I think, again, it's an area that we should focus, because I will use this phrase that everybody uses: we cannot recycle our way out of the problem. Unfortunately, I am not against recycling. We'll have to go to use recycling and to innovate more towards that, but at the same time, we'll have to reduce the plastic production.
Thank you. Thank you, Talia. I'm going to jump in with a question, if that's okay, Mart.
Definitely.
Talia, I'd like to take advantage of you being amongst us. I mentioned in my presentation the risks related to plastics, but obviously Planet Tracker is the expert on this subject. So I was wondering if you could give us your thoughts on what kind of risks the consumer-facing companies that use a lot of plastics are exposed to, perhaps the ones kind of and most important over the coming years in the build-up to 2025.
Yeah, thanks so much, Rosa. That's a great question. I will be honest, I think that corporates need to be very careful to not use greenwashing techniques. I think that you mentioned the greenwashing in your presentation as well. Greenwashing itself carries two major risks: reputational risk, that if found out, then it causes damage to the brand, which is very important for consumer companies, and also financial risk that comes from litigation. And there are two angles from that. There are consumer agencies that they are looking at the greenwashing, like the Competition and Markets Authority in the UK, and also there are financial regulators that are also looking into that, like the FCA in the UK, the SEC in USA, and others. So I think that greenwashing is crucial to look at the moment, and I am afraid that sustainability and greenwashing may be the biggest mis-selling scandal of all time. Thank you.
Really interesting. Thank you. I'll hand over to Mart for the next question, but just to kind of, that certainly fits with what we found, and when we've researched into the litigation trends on plastics, definitely greenwashing is absolutely up there and is becoming increasingly a focus of the activities of ClientEarth as well. So very interesting. I'll hand over to Mart for the next question.
Thanks, Rosa. Yes, I have a question for Kelly. With your investor alliance, what are the major motivations for the investors in the alliance to start working on this topic? Perhaps the question is, which risks are fundamental for your members? Why do they agree to join?
Plastics is one of the most quickly growing areas of interest because it is one of the areas where the science is coming out so rapidly and just exposing the scale of the problem. And I believe that the full scale of the plastics pollution issue is not yet understood, especially when thinking about the health implications of exposure to plastics or microplastics. How does it affect the human body and the like? So I think our participants in the PSIA are participating because they recognize that it is a burgeoning issue, and they are tracking a number of issues. And so the role that As You Sow can help fill is staying up to date on some of this research and then disseminating that to our participants. So I think just awareness of the severity of the issue, and that it's not going away, and there's just going to be increasing demand to identify solutions, and that persons are increasingly asking that they ensure that their holdings are not invested in plastic polluting companies. So trying to discern one company's progress from another company's lack of action has been really difficult. And as we've already discussed, even those that aren't taking the most action are not taking enough. So that caliber for action and that caliber for success, if I dare call it success, is changing rapidly. So wanting to coordinate with one another and make sure that we have a unified voice on this.
Thanks.
Thanks, Kelly. I'm going to jump in here with a question that's been posed on the chat, directed at Arthur at Achmea. The question really relates to whether and if Achmea has considered calculating its own plastic footprint. Is this something that you've thought about doing? Are there any methodologies that you're aware of where investors perhaps could make their assessment of how they're exposed to plastic-related risks through their own plastic footprint? Would welcome any thoughts on that.
Thank you, Rosa, and it's an interesting suggestion. I think at this time of development of particularly ESG data, we can assess our impact at a certain level. I think we did also for our previous plastic engagement, we did a portfolio due diligence to see which companies in industries that we invest in were most exposed to the risks in the plastic value chain. We then selected the plastic packages. I think there are not enough very detailed data for us as an investor to assess a very detailed plastic footprint that would be useful at this time. Besides, we do actually have another footprint to on the agenda for next year, and that's a wider biodiversity impact footprint, which is also quite a challenge. But we'll see maybe if in that biodiversity data there are sub-data, better data on plastics, we could make a more detailed footprint. But I think for now, identifying companies to engage with, we have sufficient higher level data, and it's more important, I think, to start engagement with these companies than to calculate a footprint in too much detail.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Yeah, so within our research, we looked at the data of Influence Map, which I think is relatively new in the plastics domain. And I'm curious if you as an investor already, Arthur, this question is for you, already looked at lobbying on plastics. And what do you think you could expect from companies on this? Or do you think you could include it in your engagements?
Yes, it's a good question, Mart. We did address that to some extent in our engagement with the packagers. We asked what industry organizations they were part of, and to what extent the positions of these organizations were aligned with the positions that the companies publicly expressed. One of the reasons for asking to publicly support the UN treaty was that it was then clear that that company publicly was at least supporting this global legislation, and that others then could maybe, once they would find that a company maybe through an industry platform that they were liaised to expressed other opinions, that at least that difference could be exposed. We have not been investigating that ourselves in much detail because, well, you have to choose some focus every now and then in these engagements. But I think there's an excellent role for Influence Map to expose possible discrepancies between public statements of companies and what they do, maybe also through industry organizations.
Perfect, thanks. I will also send a link of the full Influence Map report on the research that they did.
Yeah,
I think it's
sure.
even more informative.
Great.
Thanks.
Thank you. I think that's really interesting, and I think definitely one of the main kind of takeaways from some of the presentations and some of this conversation for me is that kind of inconsistency, that you might see a company performing well on one particular aspect or having an interesting initiative that gets to the point, but that doesn't necessarily mean that there aren't kind of things to really look out for on different subjects. And I think lobbying is definitely one of those aspects, that what companies are saying to their consumers and to their investors might be quite different from what they're saying to legislators. So it's also our role to really challenge those kind of inconsistencies. There's a question in the chat which I think is really interesting, and I'm going to kind of leave it open as to who would like to kind of give some reflections on the answer. I'm assuming that no one's going to know the answer, but if they do, then I want to hear it. I mentioned in my presentation the links with climate and climate impacts, and a question that's come through on the Q&A is if we know how much of the consumer goods companies, of the grocery retailers, scope 3 emissions are linked to their use of plastic packaging. And I think that's a really interesting question. I'm not aware of any studies. I know one company that has disclosed information on scope 3 emissions linked to plastic, but I don't know if anyone else is aware of any developments in that sphere. Talia, perhaps you might know of some, or Arthur, so please jump in if you've got any ideas.
I am afraid I do not know the answer. I don't know how much it is linked in the packaging. I'm really sorry.
I can say that for the plastic packages, the scope 3 emissions from the raw plastic materials that they sourced was a very important part of scope 3, up to 70–80%. So for that part of the plastic value chain, there was a clear incentive and urgency to, for example, increase the use of recycled materials to reduce their scope 3. And it would be indeed an interesting question, maybe also to consumer goods companies and retailers to see what part of their scope 3 the plastic packaging would consist.
Great, definitely one for the future, I think.
Definitely, yeah.
Right. I also see that there's a question for VBDO, and I can quickly answer it. If there will be a scorecard which investor or pension funds are most advanced in plastic footprint reduction, that has not yet been included in our pension funds or benchmarks, but could be an option for the near future. I will take it to the pension fund team. I have another question for Talia. So you already talked about risks for companies, but how do you think these risks affect investors, and what do you think should be their first priority?
Yeah, great. Thank you so much for this question. I think that the key risk that the financial institutions are facing is the regulatory risk. So, for example, I will just give a very hypothetical example. If a portfolio manager that has a sustainable fund in one of these 18 companies in your report, that the report shows that they don't perform very well towards the sustainable targets. It is possible to trigger a regulatory check. And the regulator will go back to the investor, and they will need to be able to give a proof that the fund is actually green and sustainable. So for me, the asset managers need to make sure that they do a thorough process and check before they actually start funding, in order to ensure that they are protecting themselves. Transparency and traceability is key in order for them to prove in any check that their fund and their investment is actually sustainable. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. So transparency and traceability. Thanks. All right. Rosa, do you have another question, or shall I continue?
Yes, I've got another question for Kelly, actually. Kelly, I'm curious, you've obviously been doing the engagement with the companies for a couple of years now, and I'm curious to see if you've noticed any particular changes in corporate attitudes to this particular topic, whether in terms of kind of the seniority of the people that are dealing with it, or their receptiveness to some of the things that you're saying, anything along those lines.
What a good question. Thank you, Rosa. I joined As You Sow in 2018, and I think since that time, the ease of scheduling a meeting with companies has changed. We used to have to reach out, a couple of times, and we would begin those meetings by demonstrating the importance of plastics, plastics packaging and pollution, and why companies needed to take action. Now we get to skip that part in these dialogues, and companies, are pretty well aware of the issue. I think corporate reporting on this issue, while still needing vast improvement, has changed. I think we used to see no reporting at all. And then the Ellen MacArthur Foundation Global Commitment was some of the first reporting that we saw as far as tons of plastic and percentage of plastic that met a 100% recyclable, reusable, or compostable goal. Some of those baseline data points are more readily available. So it's growing. We still need to see a lot more transparency. Our scorecard ranks 10 different metrics on sustainability, including things like whether or not the company has a public stance on EPR, whether or not the company is participating in any active lobbying on these issues, and the like. But certainly it is continuing to grow, and the reception of companies to make change is improving.
Super, thanks.
All right. I have another question for Arthur. So we've seen that As You Sow is, for example, engaging with Walmart, which is a grocery retailer from the Investor Alliance. In our report, we've mainly looked at UK and EU grocery retailers, and we can see that they're actually underperforming. And it's also, they have, of course, own brand and branded content, gathering plastics. Arthur, do you see a potential for also engagement with grocery retailers in the EU and the UK?
Yeah, definitely. And in a new engagement project that we're starting, we specifically aim to select also a few of the European retailers that were featured in the report. So depends, of course, on exposure in our portfolios, also portfolios of the clients for which we do the engagement. But we found a few. I cannot mention the names currently, but possibly anytime soon.
Great, great to hear. Thank you. All right, Rosa.
Yeah, just one final question for me. Another thing that I was kind of curious to hear a little bit more about. Talia, you mentioned the Alliance to End Plastic Waste. Arthur, you also mentioned the kind of blog that Planet Tracker had written on the Alliance to End Plastic Waste. For those of you that don't know, it's a sort of industry-funded initiative focused on waste management aspects of plastics. Talia, I just wondered if you could give us a couple of thoughts on what Planet Tracker found about the Alliance and what might be the problems with some of those initiatives, just to explain a little bit more to those that not familiar with it, why initiatives like these might raise problems.
Yeah, of course. Thank you. So we found we did the research in Alliance to End Plastic Waste, and we check all the their progress reports, and we want to see how they have done since they launched till now. We believe that this is a very sophisticated form of greenwashing, if I may say. It is in the form of clean crowding. Basically, this one is hiding in a group, and they are going at the pace of the slowest adapter. So specifically for the Alliance to End Plastic Waste, it is an initiative of over 70 members that they have set targets, and from what you can understand from their title, they are trying to end plastic waste. But if you look at their progress and in their reports, you will see that they are actually producing way more plastic that they are actually removing, and not only that, they are not even able to remove even the amount that they have targeted for. So for us, these initiatives, and when corporates and companies are joining them, they have to do a very good due diligence and to make sure that they are certain what they are signing for, because they have a reputational risk once they have joined them.
Really interesting, thank you. I think another kind of reinforcement that looking at solutions kind of at the end of pipe stage without also thinking about the source and feeding more and more plastic into the planet is really key. So thanks, Talia, that's really interesting.
Yeah.
Mart, you're on mute, I think.
Yeah, I think we can't hear you, Mart. Sorry.
Sorry. Yeah. So thank you for this. I don't have any other questions, Rosa. I don't know if you have any more questions. Thanks. I think a lot has been discussed, and I would like to thank you for answering our questions in the panel. Could you go to the next slide? Because I would like to wrap up a bit earlier than expected, but I don't think that's a big problem. Yeah, perhaps two takeaways. I think that we're sharing a lot of the messages in our different reports, researches, and activities, and echoing the same message. But I don't think that's wrong. I think it's a positive thing that we're all behind the same message. And other than that, yeah, we saw today 50 participants, of which a lot of them were investors, and I think that's quite high for a single thematic webinar in the Netherlands. So I would like to thank all the participants for joining this session, and also, of course, thanking Arthur, Talia, and Kelly, and of course our partner Rosa for joining us in this project. Before wrapping up, I would like to ask the investor participants to fill in a form. I will put it in the chat. It's just for a follow-up, and it's a few questions on what your needs are on this topic and what you're already doing, because yeah, it's our ambition to take this topic also a bit further with VBDO, and we're looking forward to hear what your ambitions as an investor are. So please take 3 minutes to fill it in, and we hope to follow up next week or yeah, when it's put. All right. Then again, thank you for joining us. Next slide, please. And I would like to wish you all a good afternoon and evening, and I hope to see you soon in another VBDO webinar. Thank you all.
Thank you all.
Thank you very much.